Okay, folks, we're going to get moving along with the rest of our sessions for this morning. So I want to introduce Nancy Rechcigl from Syngenta Flowers. She's going to talk to us about insect pest identification. Again, if you haven't downloaded the handouts, please do that on the materials section. As you have questions, type that into the chat box in the Go to Training Control panel. We'll field those questions at the end of each session. It seems like I've figured out what the problem with the audio is, so I'm sorry that we had some breaks in there with some other audio coming in. Not sure where that was coming from, but I don't seem like it was having any problems with it towards the end of the presentation. So thank you for being patient with us. With that, Nancy, let me get this turned over to you. Let me turn your microphone on first. Just give me 1 second here. Okay, Nancy, you should have audio.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. And
Okay.
now I will hand over the computer for you. You should be able to share your screen now.
Oops. Okay. Okay, well, thank you, Brian.
All right, I'll take it away.
Okay. So before you can embark on a biological control program, it's really important to be able to identify the key pests that can affect your crops and recognize the damage that they cause. It's also important to be familiar with their different life stages so you can scout successfully and make some good choices regarding the type of biologicals that you choose, and also so that you can make the releases at the proper time. Today we'll be highlighting some of the key pests that can cause problems in the production of ornamental crops. And due to the limited time of this section, I'm really going to be pointing out some of the key characteristics and morphological features to look for when making an ID. Leaf miter can be a serious problem on certain crops and difficult to get under control if you don't catch it early. This small yellow-black fly that you see up here in the corner is called the serpentine leaf miner because of the serpentine mining that it does on the foliage. The female uses her ovipositor to puncture the leaf surface, which causes those small dots or stipple marks that you see down here at the bottom. She uses these puncture wounds to feed on the plant sap, but in a small percentage of these stipples, she will deposit an egg. And depending upon the temperature, you can start to see a mine develop in about 4 days. It begins as a small thread-like mine, like you can see up here, eventually enlarging as the larvae develops in size. The major damage caused by the larval stage is actually as it grows and it mines through the mesophyll of the leaf, causing that serpentine pattern. And if it gets too extensive, the plants can be unsalable. The life cycle can vary really quite a bit depending upon the temperature in your greenhouse. But generally, under warm to moderate conditions, they can complete a life cycle in about 19 days. And after egg hatch, the larvae will go through 3 larval stages that actively feed within the leaf tissue. And then it cuts its way out of the leaf in order to pupate. The outer skin will become hard and it will shrink in, and it forms that hard pupal case that you see there on the bottom. Generally, within 7 days of pupating, a new adult fly will emerge, and those can be monitored using the yellow sticky cards. Moving on to aphids. Aphids are small, pear-shaped, soft-bodied insects, and they can really vary quite a bit in size depending upon what species they are. They're often green in color, but that can vary also depending upon what they're feeding on. They do prefer to feed on the younger, tender tips of the terminals of the plant, flower buds, but you can also find them on the stems like you see here. Because they do have piercing, sucking mouth parts, they do excrete honeydew as they feed, which is this sticky substance. So you may see something sticky on the leaf surface, or you may see this dark sooty mold growing on the honeydew, and that would be a good indication that you have a sap sucking pest present on your crop. Aphids will tend to feed on that newer tissue, so the leaves may be curled or distorted. They may often turn yellow in color. They can fall from the plant. They also molt as they grow, and so you may also see the presence of these cast white skins here, like you see here on the bottom. Now, the life cycle of the aphid is outlined here. Aphids are parthenogenic, which means that they are capable of reproducing without mating. So essentially, all aphids are female, and they give birth to live young. And once the conditions on the plant become crowded, or the plant that they're feeding on becomes severely affected and low in vigor, they will start to produce winged aphids, also called alates. And these aphids will take flight, move on to another host, and continue the cycle. Now, aphids will overwinter in the greenhouse as an aphid, but they can also overwinter as an egg. And in the fall, as the temperatures and light conditions begin to change, males and female aphids are produced. They'll mate, and then the female aphids will deposit eggs, which will overwinter and hatch in the spring. Now, there are many characteristics that are used for IDing aphids, but for today I'm going to highlight some of the specific areas of the aphid to pay attention to with respect to size, shape, and color. And that is the forehead area up here, the siphons or cornicles that you see here, which are these long tube-like projections out the back end of the aphid, and also the cauda. I'm going to cover some of the common aphids that you might encounter in ornamental production. So one you might find that's a fairly large aphid is the potato aphid. It generally is green in color, but that can also vary depending upon what they're feeding on. One of the things to look for with potato aphids is this dark stripe along the back side of the body. You'll see that it's kind of slightly darkened. Also, they tend to have very long cornicles, cylindrical cornicles that are somewhat colorless, and the cauda is also quite long too. Very characteristic of potato aphid. Now, the foxglove aphid is another large aphid. This one tends to be more yellow green in color. The antennae are really long, somewhat longer than the body, but the cornicles tend to be down here, tend to be surrounded by this dark spot at the base. And so that's really quite diagnostic. Also, the cauda tends to be very short, which you can see back here. Some of the smaller aphids you might encounter is the green peach aphid. This also can vary in color from yellow-green to a darker green. They have long antennae, and their cornicles are light green, but they tend to have somewhat a darkened area along at the end, at the tip. And they do have kind of a somewhat elongated cauda. One of the characteristic features that I look for green peach aphid is up here at the head. Looks like it's been smacked with a 2x4. You can see that very prominent indentation on the head of the aphid. Now, in contrast, the melon aphid, also a smaller aphid, does not have that indentation. The head tends to be more rounded in appearance, and it doesn't have that indentation. It also tends to be a darker green aphid, can be mottled also, has these very dark, short cornicles, and a very short, light-colored cauda at the end. Black bean aphids are really quite distinct. Their color is kind of a dark gray to a dull black, and they have these white markings along their body. Their cornicles tend to be very short, and so they're quite distinctive when you see them. Now, the leaf curl plum aphid is one that you can encounter in the summer. They tend to like plants in the Asteraceae family. They tend to be kind of a green to a yellow-green or yellow-brown in color. They have very short antennae, and their body tends to be more mounded. It's still pear-shaped, but it tends to be a little bit more mounded. Their cornicles are very short, as is their cauda. So you can hardly see them on the plum aphid. Now again, for confirmation or when in doubt, it is always best to bring a sample to your local extension office so that you can get the ID confirmed. Now, being involved in ornamental production, I'm sure all of you have encountered thrips at some period of time. They're small, slender, soft-bodied insects that can vary quite a bit in size and also in color, depending upon what species you have. They are attracted to flowers because of the pollen and also because of their colors, and they do need the pollen in order to reproduce. But you can also find nymphs as well as the adults feeding on the young foliage and buds. Now, they do have rasping mouth parts, and what they do is they scrape the leaf surface and feed on the sap that's released from the damaged cells. That feeding can cause plants, the foliage to look puckered or distorted. You may have some scarring on the flower buds, and sometimes on plants with a harder cuticle, the injury might even look somewhat linear or kind of scrape-like, may have a white or silvery appearance, or in this case down here, this is chili thrips feeding injury on India hawthorn, and the feeding injury scars are darkened but look quite linear. They are able to transmit viruses, particularly the tasboviruses, that can be a problematic issue in ornamental production, so you do want to get these things under control as soon as possible. Now, the thrips that's pictured here is a picture of a western flower thrips. It tends to be a yellow thrips with a very dark abdomen, and it is slightly larger in size than some of these other thrips, the eastern flower thrips or the citrus thrips that are also common in production facilities. These two tend to be yellow thrips, as is the chili thrips, which is pictured here. Chili thrips tends to be a much smaller thrips compared to western flower thrips and does have a yellow body. There's some other thrips that you should be aware of. Echinothrips is one that you can encounter in the greenhouse, and that can be identified by this white pattern on its wings up here. And this is a nice picture of one of the larval stages. Again, really in order to accurately ID thrips, it's really important that they're mounted on a microscope slide and looked at and examined under a microscope. You can look at some of these morphological features and identify them for the most part, but if you're not sure, again, bring a sample into your county specialist so you can have it ID'd properly. This slide just shows you the general biology of thrips. Eggs are deposited in the leaf. They hatch out, and you have two instars that are actively feeding on the plant. It's really the first instar that will acquire the tasbovirus if it's feeding on an infected plant. After the second instar stage, it will form a prepupa. Usually in the case of western flower thrips, it will drop to the ground and form a pupa, which then will reemerge as an adult. And now, as an adult, the adult can transmit the viruses throughout its lifetime. Whitefly is a pest that we're all familiar with, all too often in ornamental production. They're small flying insects with white wings and a yellowish body. The immature stages are flat, yellow-green in color, and almost look like a scale insect. They do have piercing, sucking mouth parts, and so you will see honeydew, the sticky honeydew deposited on leaves, and also sooty mold growing on the leaves of plants that are infested with whitefly. They're also capable of transmitting Gemini viruses that can be problematic in vegetable production. So if you're growing vegetables in your greenhouse with ornamentals, you could run into some problems if these aren't controlled properly. Now, the common ones that we encounter tend to be the greenhouse whitefly, the banded wing whitefly, and the sweet potato or silverleaf whitefly. These can be identified by morphologically by their immature stages. You see the greenhouse whitefly the immature stage has these very long projections that come out of the body, whereas they're quite a bit shorter here with the banded wing whitefly and pretty much non-existent with the silverleaf whitefly. You can also see the marks on the wings of the whitefly. The banded wing whitefly has these very distinct lines going across the body, whereas the greenhouse whitefly and the Bemesia species do not. Now, looking at the difference between Bemesia, the sweet potato or silverleaf whitefly versus the greenhouse whitefly tend to hold their wings flat over their body. They tend to be slightly larger in size. I think the wings, it tends to look like a heart shape to me, whereas with the Bemesia species, they hold their wings at an angle, almost like a roof. Now, whiteflies generally complete their life cycle within 14 to 21 days, again, depending upon the temperature. The eggs have a cigar-shaped appearance and are first creamy white when they're first deposited, and then as they age, they turn a darker brown and almost become kind of translucent in appearance. Again, you see the immature stages down here. You can tell this is the fourth instar, and that can be noted because of the dark red eyes. Moving on to two-spotted spider mites. Again, mostly these can be identified very easily because of the two dark distinct spots on either side of the body. They're generally found feeding on the undersides of the foliage or young buds. They do have these piercing needle-like mouth parts that pierce the cells and suck the contents out. And so the injury that you see with two-spotted spider mites will look like this. You'll see it, basically little white dots or spots because the cells that have been cleared out from the feeding. If feeding gets extensive, the foliage will dry and leaf tissue will fall, and certainly when it's at this stage, no chemical or biocontrol is going to be able to get that under control. That needs to be thrown away. So after egg hatch, there are 3 nymphal stages prior to becoming an adult. And the first larval stage has 3 pairs of legs, and that's important to note. So if you're monitoring and scouting, you can see, oh, this was a newly hatched larval stage, while the other stages do have 4 pairs of legs. There is a short period of quiescence between each nymphal stage, and that means that's a period of time where they don't feed or move around much on the plant. They produce a new skin underneath their old skin, and then they molt. And so this occurs between each stage here. And that's one of the reasons why they can be so difficult to control, even with chemistries. I just wanted to show you the difference between eggs from a two-spotted spider mite versus a predatory mite, because if you're monitoring and scouting, you're going to want to be able to tell the difference. You can see two-spotted mite eggs tend to be round in color, or round in shape, and they will, when they're first laid, they're going to be kind of clear-like. They start to turn a yellow color as they age. The predatory mite eggs tend to be larger in size, a little bit more oval. You can see another one over here. And that way you can tell the difference between an egg, for instance, from Californicus versus a two-spotted spider mite. It's also good to know the difference between adult male and female mites. The mite on the left is the male, tends to have an elongated abdomen. It also has 2 spots, but they're quite a bit lighter in color, whereas the female has more darker spots and a more rounded abdomen. Now this is going to look a little bit different compared with the Lewis mite. The Lewis mite looks very similar to a two-spotted mite, but it's smaller in size, and the markings on either side of the body are quite a bit less, and they're a little bit more random on the body. Lewis mite feeding injury tends to resemble more of a nutrient deficiency symptom, and you can see that here on the poinsettia plant. Doesn't have the same look like you get with a two-spotted mite injury. Now, there's also tarsinamid mites that you have to be on the lookout for. This is showing you a picture of cyclamen mite injury on dahlia. And basically, the feeding occurs in the plant terminals. They need to be protected in like areas of high humidity, so they typically feed in the terminals of the plant. And plants that are infested with cyclamen mite, the foliage tends to curl upward, be distorted, and have that really kind of a bronzy, hard, brittle appearance. and the tissue will actually feel hard to the touch as well. The picture of the cyclamen mite is over here on the right. You can see the cyclamen mite and its egg. The egg is almost about the same size as the mite itself. It is oval in appearance. Now this looks quite a bit different than a broad mite egg. Broad mites also feed in the same area of the plant, likes to feed in the terminals, and causes the leaves to actually curl downward or roll. The broad mite, though, can be identified by these very distinct eggs that they lay. They're very tiny, but even if after they emerge, you can see that the egg has these white polka dots on them, and so that's quite distinctive for broad mite, and a good way you can tell the difference between whether it's cyclamen or broad mite injury. Moving quickly to mealybugs. Mealybugs get their name from the waxy white cottony secretion that they produce that covers their body. Most tend to feed on the tender shoots and stems of the plant, but there are some that will feed on the roots. They do have piercing, sucking mouth parts, and so they will also excrete honeydew, and you'll also see some sooty mold growing on that, and that will be an indication, again, that you have a sucking pest present. They tend to coat the surface of where they are as they grow because of the waxy surface, so you really can detect them quite easily once their presence is there. Now, just wanted to highlight some of the common mealybugs that you will see in ornamental production, so you can tell the difference morphologically between them. The long-tail mealybug really has these prominent long tail filaments at the end and very long lateral filaments along the rim of the body. This is in contrast to the Mexican mealybug, who doesn't really have those really long, extensive filaments along the body. And they do have these three parallel rows of waxy tufts. And it's kind of hard to see with the slide, but there's a row here, there's a row here, and there's another row of these waxy tufts along here. The body of the Mexican mealybug is kind of yellow or orange in appearance. This one is going to look rather gray, and if you squish it, the body fluid will actually be clear. This one will have somewhat of a yellow body fluid. Now this is in contrast to the Madeira mealybug and the citrus mealybug. These look quite similar in appearance to the other mealybugs. They have projections along the side, not as long as the long-tailed mealybug. In the case of the Madeira mealybug, they do have two dark stripes along the length of the body, and you can kind of see it here. In contrast, the citrus mealybug has one dark stripe down the length of the body. Now, fungus gnats and shore flies are something that you always encounter in greenhouse production. They are attracted to damp locations, and they typically like to feed on fungi and algae. They look quite a bit different in appearance. Both have been found to carry spores of fungal pathogens such as Rhizoc, Fusarium, and Thalaviopsis and Pythium. And you can see they look quite distinct here. Fungus gnats can typically be identified because of their mosquito-like appearance. They also have this very characteristic Y-shaped pattern on the wings. I'm trying to find my pointer. And they also have this kind of U or C shape end to their abdomen. The larval stage tends to be clear, slender, and have this hard black head capsule. This is going to be in contrast to shore flies, which are more of a sturdier kind of stocky fly, black fly, with dark wings that have these 5 white spots. And you can always see that on the yellow sticky card. Their immature larval stage that also resides in the soil or media looks quite a bit different than the fungus gnat larvae, and so you can really tell the difference. These prefer to feed on algae, and so if you can keep your algae under control, you can really keep your shore flies down. The life cycle is basically the same, with the fungus gnats being slightly longer by a week, and you can see that outlined here. I can't emphasize enough how important early detection is. It is really important that you check your incoming plant material for eggs and those different immature stages in adults. Monitor the growing area for flying pests with either yellow or blue sticky cards. And also be aware of ants that are wandering around your plant material, because that's going to indicate the presence of honeydew. They like to feed on the honeydew that's excreted by many of these pests. And then, of course, the presence of sooty mold is also a good indication that you have a population of sucking pests that are present. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions that anybody might have.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. So far, we don't have anybody has not typed in any questions. While folks are thinking of some questions that they might want to ask Nancy while she is. Oh, we got one here. If you're using nematodes for fungus gnat control, is there any visual distinction in the larva?
If you're using
maybe can you tell if the fungus gnats have been infected by the nematodes? Maybe
they'll tend to not move around. You know, they do. The nematodes release bacteria that makes the larval stage sick, and so it won't be moving around as vigorously as they typically do, but you're not going to be able to tell off the bat. Really, the best way you'll see that you're getting some good control is that on your yellow sticky cards, you're not going to be, you know, seeing the numbers. And you can also monitor the potting media with little pieces of potato, and you can stick the piece of potato into the soil and leave it for a day or two. And if you pick it up, you'll see, you know, if you have the immature stage feeding on the potato. If they're infected with the nematodes, you tend not to see that as much, and they'll move a little bit slower.
Okay. While we're waiting for any more questions, I do have a quick poll that I want to take of everybody in the audience. We, like I said, have a sponsor of Syngenta. So those of you out in the audience, please select the yes or no here. If you would like to receive updates from Syngenta that would include technical and new product information, please make your choice here. And those of you who do wish to get information from Syngenta, we will forward your emails on to them so that they can contact you after the webinar is over. So it doesn't look like there's any other questions, Nancy. I thank you all for sticking in here with us. A few more people are voting here. Please wrap up your answer here for this question shortly here. We will have some other polls here over the next few hours, but I don't want to take any more time here. So Nancy, thank you very much. I'm going to switch this over to our next speaker.